U.S.-Turkey ties appear locked in a tailspin after Trump raised tariffs on Turkish metal goods and the Turkish lira continues to plunge. What's next for the two NATO allies? As First Lady of the U.S., Melania Trump's parents were granted U.S. citizenship last week, but using the very same immigration process that her husband is attacking. How is Trump's latest immigration hypocrisy coloring his reputation? Welcome to The Point. I'm Cheng Lei, sitting in for Liu Xin. The Turkish lira hit a new record low on Monday, jolting global markets and dragging down emerging market currencies. The Turkish currency has been a casualty of a deepening crisis sparked by a worsening spat between Washington and Ankara over the detention of the American priest Andrew Brunson. U.S. President Donald Trump ramped up his attack on Turkey last Friday by doubling steel and aluminium tariffs. Turkey plans to retaliate against the U.S., with Turkish President Recep Erdogan warning that his country will seek new friends. So, who will be Turkey's new friends, and how much spillover will we see from Turkey's currency crisis on emerging markets? For more, I'm joined from Berlin by Dr. Günter Seufert, Senior Fellow at Stiftung Wissenschaft and Politik. From Washington, D.C., Professor Doga Eralp at the School of International Service at American University, and also from D.C., Dr. Bulent Aliriza, Director of the Turkey Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Welcome, gentlemen. So let me start by asking about the economy. Obviously, the Lira has lost around 45% against the US dollar this year, largely over worries about Erdogan's calls for lower interest rates and worsening ties with the US. And Erdogan, of course, is blaming it on external factors, calling on his people to sell dollars to win the war of independence. From what you can see, let me ask you first, Dr. Günter Seufert, is Turkey able to win the war, given that Erdogan doesn't want to hike interest rates, doesn't want IMF support, and doesn't want capital controls?
I think Turkey is not able to win that, what it calls himself, economic war, because it's not only due to the crisis about the American pastor Andrew Brunson. It's a structural problem of Turkey's economy. We know that Turkey experienced huge account deficits in the last 10 years, about $75 billion a year. We know that there is a huge amount of debt that has accumulated, and it makes about 1/3 of Turkey's whole economy. About 70% of Turkey's economy is running with debts in foreign currency, and therefore the crisis was looming, and it is only by coincidence that is in a way happening together with the crisis about the pastor.
Professor Eralp, do you agree that this war cannot be won?
Well, I mean, obviously this is a ongoing crisis that may affect other emerging markets. It's not necessarily a confrontation that would have any winners. It's really a lose-lose situation. The question is who would lose more? And obviously in this particular instance, Turkey has a lot to lose than the US. Turkish imports to US doesn't really add up much, but overall when you look into how US retaliation, especially on currency, impacts the Turkish economy and overall futures of Turkish fiscal markets, this definitely would have a more devastating impact on Turkey, and this definitely calls for, let's say, a little bit of a cooler minds on both sides.
Dr. Aliriza, I mean, one of the worries that international investors have, of course, is about this expansion of presidential powers, including the fact that Erdogan's son-in-law is the Minister of Finance and Treasury, and Al-Bayrak is promising an economic action plan. We've seen some liquidity measures from the central bank that's helped the lira a little bit. How effective do you think this plan will be in terms of convincing international investors?
Well, given the conditions on the global market, the ability of any individual state, and that includes the emerging market states like Turkey, to deal with their problems within their borders is very difficult. In fact, if not impossible. It's the global forces were running in favor of Turkey and the development of the Turkish economy as it relied on the constant inflow of foreign funds. Those are drying up, and those concerns have been exacerbated by the domestic political developments, and then, of course, the fight with the United States, specifically President Trump. So put all those together, talk about a perfect storm, and you know, the measures that have been taken so far clearly not been able to stop the fall in the currency, and I'm not sure that even rate hike, which is what is being speculated about, will do it. It's a bigger problem than the one that could be handled with the kind of palliative measures.
So, Dr. Seufert, you mentioned the huge external debts. You know, they're about $467 billion, more than half of Turkish GDP, and we've got about a quarter of the short-term of that is in short-term debt due within the year. So, without rate hikes, without IMF support, you know, without capital controls, how close is Turkey to an all-round financial crisis?
I think it's close to a financial crisis, and I think what our colleague already said is quite true, but I think there is an additional problem to it. I think what I call it the kind of double bind of the Turkish communication strategy, because on the one hand side you have the finance minister, Mr. Albayrak, the son-in-law of Turkey, of President of State Erdogan, that is trying to use a rational language and to, in a way, calm down the investors, or give trust, inspire trust to the investors. But at the same time we have very simultaneously a rhetoric in Turkey that talks about a war, an economic war. We see now that people are prosecuted for offering critical remarks in social media, and therefore this double bind of the communication is not able to instill trust in investors, and I think this aggravates the situation and makes it more likely that Turkey is experiencing a real financial crisis.
Professor Eralp, do you think that's part of the problem too?
Yes. Well, obviously Turkey is now in a current of state of financial crisis, but it's rather how Turkey manages this financial crisis. The way things look, I think the government is trying to still evade the immediate measures that needs to be taken, and there's an upcoming holiday, and we have to see the type of measures the Turkish government is willing to take to ensure the creditors at least some sort of a minimal trust that Turkey could bounce back from this crisis. But the rhetoric around waging a war and other kind of confrontational narratives definitely doesn't help at this point. So we need definitely a more clear message to the international markets that Turkey is serious in undertaking certain reforms that would be willing to address the structural issues that led to this crisis in the first place.
Dr. Aliriza, we're seeing quite steep falls in global markets, especially currencies for emerging markets, as well as European, Asian stocks, even US stock index futures. But how big do you think that spillover effect would be?
I think it would be unlimited. But clearly this is a major problem for Turkey, for Turkish banks. It is a problem for European banks that are exposed to possible Turkish contagion in Spain, in Italy, and in France. But the ripples, I think, will not extend beyond the interested parties that I mentioned. I saw that the Dow Jones fell on Friday because of worries about Turkey, but I think that's an exaggeration of the possible impact. It is a very serious problem, but it's a serious problem primarily for Turkey and those who are there, and that doesn't really affect U.S. Or, frankly, beyond European banks.
That's good. Now, Professor Seufert, let's talk about Erdogan's leverage. We know that Spanish banks, Italian banks, French banks are all owed some about $100 billion in total. And also the 19-member area runs a trade surplus with Turkey. So what could be the consequences for EU economies if Turkey goes through this protracted crisis/recession?
I think there is a risk naturally for the financial market of Europe. I don't see such a great risk for the European economy as a whole, because when it comes, for example, with Germany, Turkey is part of the German value chain, and these are all very long-term and very institutionalized relations, I can't see any deterioration in this regard. But I think there is another aspect to it. We talked about who is the winner and who is the loser of that crisis. And I said the economic loser will be Turkey, but when it comes to matters of security, of foreign policy, of defense policy, I think then also the West, particularly the US, and even more than the US, Europe could be a loser if the situation in Turkey is destabilizing even more.
Yes, Professor Eralp, take us through the ramifications about, I guess, immigration, because the EU relies heavily on Turkey to contain the flow of migrants trying to reach Europe. Is that good leverage for Erdogan?
Well, the issue is not necessarily about leverage, but now when we look into the impending crisis, yet another crisis in Syria with the imminent fall of Idlib, Turkey may need to host another additional 2 million Syrian refugees. And given the current context of the economic crisis, Germany primarily needs to step in and address Turkey's concerns about, in case of such an influx, how Turkey would be able to basically finance building again new refugee camps, or at least hosting these new refugees in Turkey. And I don't think at this point President Erdogan would be willing to use the immigration deal as a bargaining chip with the European Union, as he is very well aware that he needs the strong support of Germany. And I think this would also be a good signal for the Turkish politicians that at the end of the day they would still need the European Union on their side, even in any case of a fallout with the United States.
And Dr. Aliriza, what about the Russian element? Because in his New York Times article, Erdogan did kind of threaten that Turkey would start looking for new friends and allies.
It's not just Russia, it's also China that we have to put into the equation. In terms of Ankara's ability to actually bring Moscow in on its side and deal with the financial crisis, I think frankly it's too much to hope for. Russia is not in a position to provide the kind of financial assistance or funds that Turkey needs to maintain its public projects and growth strategy. Yes, there is a strong energy relationship. Yes, they're talking to each other about building a nuclear reactor in Turkey. Yes, they're talking about they have a dialogue within the Astana process together with Iran about Syria. But there's a fundamental divergence with respect to Syria. The Russian government is behind Assad, is about to move into Idlib, where there are Turkish-backed opposition forces. So that relationship, I don't think, is going to be without problems. As for China, President Erdogan today mentioned again his desire to get support from China as part of Turkish involvement in the Belt and Road Initiative. Again, it remains to be seen whether China would be interested in becoming a major player as Turkey tries to get out of this financial crisis, and changing your alignment, both in the political as well as in the financial area, is difficult for any country, and I think particularly difficult for Turkey, which has been a member of the Western Alliance and an aspirant for EU membership, for it to switch to another track.
Okay, I'm afraid that's all we have time for, although I'd love to get your opinion on what the resolution for this crisis is, but we'll have to leave that for another time. Thank you so much for our guests. From Berlin, Dr. Günter Seufert, Senior Fellow at Stiftung Wissenschaft and Politik. From Washington, D.C., Professor Doga Eralp at the School of International Service of American University. And also from D.C., Dr. Bulent Aliriza, Director of the Turkey Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Thank you so much. We'll be taking a short break, and when we come back, U.S. President Trump is lashing out at what he and the Republicans have dubbed chain migration. But his in-laws just became U.S. citizens using that very same process. What's behind the double standard, and what does it say about U.S. immigration policy? Stick around. Chain migration. US President Donald Trump wants it to end to protect national security. But his wife, First Lady Melania Trump, who immigrated to the US from Slovenia, just used chain migration to make her father and mother naturalized US citizens last week. So what's behind this latest PR nightmare for Trump, and what would the policy's end mean for the US's proud legacy of immigration? How is this shaping public opinion of Trump? Joining me for the discussion from Cleveland, Ohio, is David Leopold, former president of the American Immigration Lawyers Association, and here in the Beijing studio, Yujie, an American freelance journalist. Welcome to the show. So let me start by asking you, Mr. Leopold, can you briefly describe what the term chain migration means and how it works in the US? How is it different from, say, the diversity lottery or merit-based immigration?
Yeah, well, chain migration is really a pejorative term that's thrown out there by anti-immigrant folks like the Trump administration and the president himself. Really what we're talking about in terms of U.S. law is family unity immigration. There's really basically two ways to immigrate to the United States. One is based on a family tie, an immediate relative, a spouse, a daughter, etc. The other way is based on an employment tie. That is, an employer sponsors an immigrant, or if that immigrant is extraordinary, they can sometimes sponsor themselves. So those are the two basic ways to immigrate. And as opposed to a merit-based system, which you find in places like Australia or Canada, where it's done on a point basis. In other words, you're given so many points for your education or for your background, for your language skills. We actually do have a bit of that in our system. A couple of categories of immigration are based on merit. So that's really the difference between the two. And I would like to emphasize again that what we see with this administration is just brazen hypocrisy, because the president runs around talking about so-called chain migration, family unity immigration, as if it's some horrible thing, except when he doesn't. And he doesn't when it comes to his wife, Melania, when it comes to his first wife, Ivana, and when it comes to Melania's parents, the Knaves, that just became citizens, as you pointed out last week.
So, Kay, I know that you're a bona fide Trump critic. What are your thoughts on Trump's immigration policy views, and what do you think of this latest development?
Well, I wish I could say that it's a surprise, but there's absolutely nothing that he could do at this point that would be shocking to me, except maybe tell the truth. Just the level of hypocrisy that we've seen from him from day one. I mean, ever since he started his campaign, everything has been fake news coming from Trump himself. So I wish it were different, and I wish it weren't the case, but I'm not surprised.
But why would Trump supporters be behind, this calling for the end to chain migration? Mr. Leopold.
Why would they be behind it? I'll tell you why. What we've seen with this administration, and it's more than a dog whistle now. I mean, it's actually blatant racism. But what we see with this administration is an attempt to close the doors to all immigrants. Whether they be family-based immigrants, we see hostility and actual despicable behavior by locking up children in cages who come to the border seeking asylum. And when it comes to the actual immigration system that's in place, and I'll be the first to tell you, that system needs to be reformed. We've been working for immigration reform and amendments in fixing that system for many years now. But when it comes to that, what Mr. Trump does is he goes to the most extremist groups in the country, one of which is the Federation for American Immigration Reform. The other one is the Center for Immigration Studies. These extremist groups, which have, by the way, been designated hate groups by the Southern Poverty Law Center. And that's where he gets his idea. He pulls in people like Stephen Miller, the avowed white nationalist in the, not avowed, but the white nationalist that he relies on. And so you get these despicable policies and these campaigns, and he's really trying to play to his base. And his base is predominantly angry older white people who are in fear of their position. Look, immigration has always helped America. It's always built America. We bring in the best and the brightest, whether they're working in the fields or whether they're working in our laboratories. And it's always made America what it is. It's always made America a prosperous, exciting place to be with a diverse tapestry of cultures. And this administration is hostile, completely hostile to the fundamental concept of immigration, which is what made our country.
Kay, I mean, are there angry white people, for example, in your family or in your midst, who are for the end to chain migration because of those appeals to extremist groups?
Absolutely. I mean, unfortunately, the majority of my family members, I come from a really large family, kind of a classic Irish Catholic American family where I have 8 uncles and 1 aunt, and they are all Republican, you know, flag-bearing Trump supporters. And my family is sort of the black sheep section, so all of us are, you know, hippie, Democrat, liberals. For example, I mean, I was at the march against Trump after his inauguration because it was such a powerful event for me because that's literally the epitome of what it means to be American and be in America. I mean, it was just this massive gathering of democracy in the form of all different races, cultures, religions, you know, gender affiliation, whatever you want to call it. I mean, it was just, I'm speechless when I think about that because of how moving it was. And I think we just need to cling to that and to not become silent despite our frustration.
Mr. Leopold, Trump is fond of linking immigration to terrorism. Is there a legitimate link in U.S. cases of terrorism to immigrants?
No, there isn't. I mean, let's think about U.S. terrorism. The Oklahoma City bombing. Who perpetrated that? A white war veteran. The mass shootings that we are plagued with in this country because of the refusal to have common sense limits on access to automatic weapons. Who perpetrated those? White men. I mean, I could go down the list. And, you know, yes, we've had a couple. There was the San Bernardino attack and the one in New York earlier in the year, and, of course, 9/11. But the bottom line is this. We have had, on a daily basis, millions of immigrants pour into this country to visit and then they leave. On a yearly basis, hundreds of thousands of people do immigrate to the United States. It's not even statistically measurable. And we have protocols, we've always had protocols in place to keep out national security threats. What this administration did, days into the administration, was change the immigration enforcement priorities by saying to Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and that is the bureau that chases immigrants inside of the United States, detains them, arrests them, and deports them. What we said to them was, look, you know what? Do what you want. Be rogue. Go after grandmothers the same way you go after potential terrorists. That's Donald Trump. That's what he told them to do. And I'll tell you what, that makes us less safe. It makes us more vulnerable to security threats and to people who would do our communities harm. Why? Because Immigration and Customs Enforcement is now focused on getting some grandmother who's been here for 14, 15 years and raised a family, as opposed to getting somebody who's a threat to the community. It's racist because it's predominantly focused on people of color in this country, and it needs to stop. We need to get back to what America is supposed to be. It's never been a perfect place, and we've always had problems. But this is a policy coming from the White House, the immigration policy, enforcement policy, targeting people of color and designed to close our borders, period. That's not what we're supposed to be doing, nor is it good for the country.
Kay, we can be talking about this hypocrisy, you know, of Trump, you know, all around the world, but I think, do you think that Trump supporters are so immune to any Trump bashing or criticisms that even, you know, such blatant hypocrisy goes unnoticed?
Absolutely. I mean, from my personal experience, I've witnessed, I say there are 3 levels of Trump supporters. So there's the first level, which is the CEOs, the businessmen, you know, the Elon Musks of the world.
Happy for the tax cuts.
Yes, who want to maintain their financial status, which I can't blame them for. But Trump, you know, espouses these views of if you're white, male, and powerful, you should stay white, male, and powerful without having earned it or without, you know, continuing to earn it. So there's the top one. The middle one is sort of the everyman, which is the majority of my family members who support Trump, who, you know, goes to work, pays his bills, loves his children, puts them through college, you know, has a wife, has a dog, and a picket fence. And they're not necessarily bad people, but the reason that they support Trump is because he's, you know, fighting the good fight for the things that they want. They want fair taxes. You know, they appreciate someone with a lot of money, who's had a lot of women, you know, who can have anything he wants, who has this amazing lifestyle. I mean, they're attracted to power, basically, so why wouldn't they support him? And then the bottom rung would be like the trailer park folks. No offense intended, but, you know, the people who don't have the access to education that others would, so they might see this figure as, okay, I mean, despite what anyone wants to say, it's a two-party system in America, so we have democracy and we have, you know, Republicans. So do you want Hillary Clinton, who's a woman? Oh, no. Or do we want Trump, you know, who's a powerful white man with money who's going to fix everything? You know, it's an easy choice for someone who maybe didn't finish high school. So that's my perspective.
And Mr. Leopold, how do you think these, you know, controversies around immigration policies will impact the midterm elections, if at all?
Well, look, the midterm elections are probably the most important set of elections in the history of the country. The Democrats, whether we see a Democratic wave across the country obviously remains to be seen. But what's important is that there's a check on this president. The Republicans who have controlled the House of Representatives for the past 18 months, well, since the president has been in office, we've had one-party control of Washington. We've had no serious checks, no serious investigations coming out of Capitol Hill on Trump, on his connections with the Russians, on the so-called collusion. All this is coming from the independent counsel and apparently doing a very effective job, judging from the fear that we can see in the president's tweeting. But that said, I think the importance of this election cannot be overstated, because the country needs to have a balance. There needs to be a check. The Republicans, frankly, have not done their job. They have capitulated, and as Kay pointed out, you have democracy and you have Republicans, and the Republicans are really the party of Donald Trump. One of these days they're going to have to answer for their collaboration with what's been going on, for their refusal to question a president who concedes to the likes of Vladimir Putin in Helsinki, who compromises our national security in the Oval Office every day. So these elections are important, because Congress needs to exercise appropriate oversight over this administration for the next 2 years.
Thank you so much to both of our guests. I wish I had more time to expound on this. In Cleveland, Ohio, David Leopold, former president of the American Immigration Lawyers Association, and here in Beijing, Yujie, an American freelance journalist. That's all from this edition of The Point. You can download the app called CGTN to watch our show, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thanks for watching. I'm Talay subbing for YouTube.